Hello, welcome to Sydney. Right now we are in the patio courtyard of the hotel that was built by Devco in the late 1960s and early 1970s, right next to Cabot House Tower. It was a tourist attraction, or at least it was enough of a tourist attraction to have a postcard made of it, and it was part of the infrastructure that Devco introduced at this time. Today's reading, which talks about Devco extensively, otherwise why would I be at this particular place, is by Keith Brown and Ruth Ann Geddes, Resorts, Culture, and Music. And this might be surprising to people because this is an article from a business journal. And I'm not a huge, particularly big fan of business, not a big fan of it as a discipline, not a big fan of it as a motivator. I'm not like a staunch anti-capitalist, but I think business is a peculiar thing to try and justify turning into a degree program. But that's an unpopular opinion. And also, this is not a good article in a number of ways. It's not that well written. It's not that well organized. It's throwing up interesting forms of data. It shows a strange map where it says this is the location of Cape Breton, and then it basically is the entire Atlantic provinces. So there's a lot of problems with this. But what I like about this reading, what I think, you don't need to like the reading for it to be justified in reading it. The thing about this article is that they are writing for a rather disinterested audience, and they're writing about culture in Cape Breton. They're not particularly interested. This might be unfair, but at least as the people who are reading this with the eye of how to develop culture as an industry, how to develop tourism as an industry specifically. The article is called Tourism Economics. The journal that it's in, it's called Tourism Economics. And it also, because the audience has no idea of what Cape Breton may or may not be, or rather, they can't. The authors can't assume that they have any idea what Cape Breton is. There's actually a really interesting history of Cape Breton that is included, and it's the focus on. It's a very quick, perhaps oversimplified, but nice outline sketch of the history of Cape Breton according to its economics, because basically. Starting in the late 19th century, coal was discovered maybe as early as Louisburg, and the idea of having coal mines from the early 1820s, 1830s is when those started to become systematized, as opposed to people just taking a pickaxe and getting some coal in order to fuel. The idea of turning it into an export economy happened in the early 19th century, and then it grew more systematized, more land claims were associated with it, mineral rights, the great sort of expansion that was happening as Nova Scotia in particular and Atlantic Canada in general became more and more industrialized, and you needed fuel for that. So you had coal, and then you have the development of the steel plant. The early 1901 was, I think, when the steel plant was officially opened, although plans for it predate that by a couple of years because they don't spring up overnight. And they were able to take the iron ore that was mined in Wabana, which is on Bell Island, just near St. John's, Newfoundland, ship it here, and with the great coal reserves that we had here, process it into steel. So now you had two industries, you had coal and you had steel. And Sydney in particular, and Cape Breton in general, was an economic generator for the first half of the 20th century. It was booming. It was a burgeoning economy. Now, the problem with it is that most of the capital would lay offshore, whether that was in Halifax, whether that was in Toronto, whether that was in London. Cape Bretoners weren't invested in the ownership. So there became, again, this history is kind of gross the way they express it, but its bluntness is part of its appeal. The idea is that Cape Bretoners were sort of dependent on the company and became this, they are responsible for us. You see a lot of scare quotes around they and the company and all that in the article. And then, it was apparent, thanks to a royal commission in the late 1960s, and then with the closure of the announcement of the closure of the steel plant in 1967, that industry was not going to be the lifeblood of the island anymore. And in comes Devco. Devco is the Cape Breton Development Corporation, which was formed in 1967, originally as a transition away from coal and quickly as away from coal and steel, because it was formed about 3 months before I'm blanking on the name of the company that owned the steel plant at the time. I want to say Hawker Siddeley, something along those lines, when they announced in October that the steel plant was going to be closing within 6 months. So Devco took the wrapping up of industry under its belt, and one of the first things it did was start building infrastructure projects. So this hotel, it's not talked about in the article, but this hotel and Cabot Tower were both built by Devco, as investments, but also because they had a lot of construction workers and engineers, and whether blue collar or white collar workers coming from offshore to run Devco, which had its own kind of problems if you think about it in terms of, but they didn't have the time. Part of their mandate was to eventually train the locals in order to do it, but they didn't have the time to do it right away. And so they had all these people come from offshore and nowhere to house them. So they built a hotel, basically, first off, for the first level of high-end construction workers, and then the tower for middle management. And Devco was actually headquartered in Cabot Tower for a number of years. The top floor, the penthouse suites, were actually, so it's like boardrooms, and then the first 3 floors were basically Devco, and then they had condo apartments. And yeah, basically it's Cape Breton's only office tower. There's or apartment building of that stature. There's a retirement assisted living facility right at the corner of Prince and Esplanade, which should be like the primo place in piece of real estate in all of Sydney, and that's the only other sort of super tall building. New hotels have been built, and so there's a bit of a skyline. But if you think about places where people live, it's just these two. It's just not a thing. It's just an observation. So anyway, so that was what Devco is. And Devco is a large part of the community. And actually, Keith Brown, who is one of the authors of this, he worked for Devco for a long time. And he also has worked at the university. He continues to work at the university. He's on faculty at the business office. At the time he wrote this, he was also the vice president of development, so I think his title. So he was there for, as the title might suggest, developing the university. So tourism in Canada, I mean, it had been around, people had been touring for years, but it was really the Centennial and Expo 67 that, where the government sort of turned it into, this is an area of the economy that we should really be supporting. We can see job creation, we can see economic benefits, tax benefits, and so on. And so the Tourism Canada started in 1971, basically as a result of that. Tourism, of course, had already existed, but now it was part of the government's turn towards industry intervention and subsidizing in order to sort of create new opportunities. Early 1970s, again, in part because of industrial decline, also saw the beginning of things like what's now the Young Canada Works program. So people were able to, students could get summer jobs or short-term contracts in order to sort of pay for their university educations and so on. I mean, maybe you've taken advantage of some of these contracts, but they were also mandated for cultural and community organized groups. So like you couldn't get a Young Canada Works to work at a hotel or at like Claire's or something, but you could get it to work for cultural industries. So there's a lot of interesting cultural collection, folks on collecting the recording of traditional fiddlers that happened because of these kind of government grants as well. And so tourism is part of that. It's a large intervention, and Nova Scotia developed its own tourism strategies as well. Now the thing to ask is, what exactly do we mean when we're talking about tourism? And tourist theory is a really interesting area. I urge you to read Dean McCannell. I urge you to read John Urry and all the people who do who talk about tourism, because for me, I think because we are contemporary people, it's difficult to disengage the study of culture from the study of tourism, because so much of what we call traditional culture is sustained in part because we can turn it into an economic product. And really, that's what this reading is about. So tourism has been defined in a number of ways, but basically it's the leisured experience of otherness. It is participating in something that is different from one's everyday culture, or everyday environment, everyday landscape. So the development of what John Urey calls the tourist gaze. The tourist gaze is the eyes that seek out difference. He's building it on the ideas of like the male gaze, for example, the sort of consumptive gaze. But what the tourist gaze does is again, as a form of leisure. You are choosing to go, whether it's travel. And tourism, of course, typically implies travel, but reading blogs and reading cookbooks and reading travel literature is another part of that. It's, I don't have a purpose to do this save for my own edification. And leisure should never be dismissed as something superfluous, but it is different from ergic. It's different from the basic sort of thrusts of the economy. So it's kind of this sort of secondary aspect. And the thing about having a tourist gaze is that people who wish to be sites for tourism cultivate the tourist gaze. They cultivate difference. They try and create an argument for why this place is distinct as opposed to any other place. Why would you, Mr. Tourist, Mrs. Tourist, come to Cape Breton, come to Jamaica, come anywhere when you could be going anywhere else? What is it about here that is sufficiently different from your quotidian interests that will encourage you to visit? So tourism is often something that people turn to when their primary industries collapse. He gives the example of Jamaica as part of it. When the bauxite mines closed, you would imagine Jamaica, beautiful weather, beautiful landscape, would be a natural place for tourism, but it didn't really develop that until one of its mainstays of industry disappeared. And they also point out that it's not simply the region in terms of the island, but even you can make this sort of micro argument. The downtown development corporations are often there in order to encourage people to come to the downtown when the businesses that used to be the reason for people to come to the downtown are no longer necessarily present. So how do you, it's not trick, that is not the right word, but how do you encourage people to come to these areas as a matter of, as a source of leisure, as a source of pleasure, fundamentally? And as well, for a downtown corporation, you would do things like you'd have cafes and you'd have entertainment venues and you'd have picturesque walks. So whereas like for example, Sydney's waterfront, it used to be a hive of docks, and it used to have warehouses, and it used to be like a thriving port city. And also the center of commerce. Well, a lot of commerce is closed because of box stores, and a lot of the hive of activity has moved to more specialized ports. So why go to the downtown? Well, now you have stores, cafes, bars, so on. You have the development of the boardwalk. So people choose to go there because it brings them pleasure, not because they have to. And so tourism is not always, because of course there are places where people go to because they have to, because they're centers of economic activity, like New York, like Toronto, that nevertheless also try and cultivate the tourist gaze. So people will go there because it's like a critical mass of things to do. But it's when you have fundamentally no other reason for going that tourism is there about now making the arguments. Sure, you don't have to come here, you want to come here. And that's what tourism is essentially trying to do. So they switched to tourism in the early 1970s, and there's this interesting quote about how it was. Before the birth of the corporation, DevCo, Cape Breton's Cabot Trail attracted motoring tourists. Cape Breton was already acknowledged for its rugged coastline, pristine green valleys, and quaint villages. Quaint. However, it lacked infrastructure to service inbound travelers. Small motels and hotels were located in some communities, and the Celtic Lodge in Ingonish catered to an upscale market, but by and large, attractions and accommodation were limited. The season spanned approximately 6 weeks during July and August. And so that's what they had going for them to begin with. So what DevCo did, they turned around and they started supporting local tourist associations, either directly supporting in terms of subsidizing or supporting in terms of providing access to networks and so on. They began to either purchase or build amenities like this place. They started, marketing the region itself, so not simply marketing the individual tourism associations, but as a collective, creating things like thinking of the place as an island destination, as opposed to a constellation of individual village and community destinations. And building golf courses, building marinas, building a whole bunch of things that would attract tourism activities. So by 1978, it owned 78 different properties. It also, was developing, so not simply in terms of creating its own stuff, but also it started loan operations for bed and breakfast programs, which was one of the first flushes of trying to, bring things into the smaller communities. But the end of the 1970s, a lot of these things had started to close again. The things that they had built, for one thing, there was a call for privatization, and that these should be not for the profit of the Crown Corporation, but for the profit of local entrepreneurs. And so Devco would sell, but then sometimes the businesses would close because they didn't necessarily have the benefit of a Crown Corporation subsidizing. And what led to this sort of first initial, not failure, but after an upswing, a downturn in it. And arguments were like poor location, poor access, weak market research, weak marketing, and costly infrastructure. And one of the goals at the time was to redirect traffic to places that wouldn't normally have tourist traffic, or had never experienced tourist traffic. And that's cool, and that's a good thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that each place needs to have absolutely everything for a particular tourist. And so you started to have this sort of weird duplication of efforts where we have built a number of hotels in Sydney, and then Glace Bay, only 20-minute drive away, wanted to build a couple of hotels as well. And it's like, yeah, but there's not the critical mass of reasons to stay an entire overnight in Glace Bay yet. So now that hotel is unlikely because, and sort of this wandering around. So basically it was the idea that the communities were still understanding themselves as in conflict and in competition with each other. So we start jumping ahead. I'll just sort of jump to these points in the conclusion before I get back into sort of one of the main thrusts. So here's a fairly substantial quote from the end. During the early stages of development on Cape Breton, each community saw each other as the competition for tourism dollars. It was an evolutionary process that was spawned from the need for joint marketing projects that saw attitudinal change move from the notion that the competition was 20 kilometers away to the realization that the competition for Cape Breton tourist dollars is other world destinations. The tourism cluster on Cape Breton developed in a broadly dispersed number of small towns and villages. Hundreds of small, locally owned businesses developed, expanded, and grew. By the very nature of small rural communities in general, and of those on Cape Breton Island in particular, local expansion of facilities was discussed, debated, celebrated, and at times vilified. That thought goes unexplored, but that's kind of fascinating. But I think it ties into the idea of the intense community on a micro scale aspect of Cape Breton Island, that basically it was a sort of zero-sum game, and that we need to have this and that community shouldn't have this, and a sort of a certain amount of infighting, and really it required this leveraging in order for people to, perhaps reluctantly, but with the wisdom of results, shift and create something that was new, that was a collective effort. Or, okay, well, we won't have a hotel, our business is basically going to be like this restaurant and this beach and so on, and then think less locally. Which is an interesting development. But here's the reason that I like people reading this, because we haven't developed culture yet. We haven't developed cultural tourism yet. And he describes, I keep on saying he, but they, Brown and Geddes, describe this moment where during one of the many reviews for the tourism sector, it's like, what's going on? How can we bolster this? People come, and then there's either not much here, or things have closed, or how do we develop this? And it seemed after a 12-hour session, the article says, basically a bunch of musicians or people from the music industry crashed it after 12 hours and said, in early spring 1986, a group of local entertainers and would-be promoters argued successfully that entertainment could be an industry on Cape Breton, not only for vocalists and musicians, but also for recording technicians, lighting crews, and technical staff. Devco began to turn its attention to another component of the cluster: culture, heritage, and entertainment. So lo and behold, you have the development of culture. We can sell this, and certain things happened. Again, the subsidizing of local music industry initiatives, subsidizing of large-scale festivals, including, of course, Celtic Colors, and the subsidizing of music performance venues, and the encouragement of performance as part of the thing that you could find here that you can't find elsewhere, things to attract the tourist gaze. And here is the money shot. Here's the quote that I want you to go off with. Groups came together and talked. Community groups wanting to celebrate their local festivals joined in the consultation. Artists took their traditional music and gave it a distinctive, upbeat Cape Breton style. The sound was marketed, the sound was showcased, the promoters were brought to Cape Breton to see and hear for themselves, and the community performed. Here, basically, now this could be a cynical reading, but I wonder how wrong I am by reading it cynically. What they're suggesting is that we had this thing, and we had the music that was being played, and you can expand this to talk about food, you can expand this to talk about dance, you can expand this to talk about folk art, you can expand this to talk about a whole realm of activities. They're focusing on music in particular, and they say, we did this thing and we changed it to make it distinctive in a way that not simply that we would recognize as distinctive, but that we could sell as a distinctive aspect, that people are coming to participate in this kind of thing. That's the question that'll haunt your dreams about what's going on, and the consequences of what happens when we are dealing with culture in a place that is largely and highly dependent on culture as a commodity for its economic well-being. Here it is. The inherently local attributes of physical beauty, friendly people, and vibrant culture. And they're good enough to put inherently local in scare quotes because they know that that is fundamentally the turn. The inherently local attributes of physical beauty, friendly people, and vibrant culture were packaged and marketed, and the industry now represents more than 200 million Canadian dollars annually to the Cape Breton economy. It's very difficult to cynically challenge what's going on to culture when you can justifiably see that the economics might be demanding it. So that's why you can be cynical, but you also have to ask, if not for this, then what? And you want to be a purist. You want to be, maybe you don't. I don't necessarily want to be a purist, but at the very least, in your heart of hearts, there's often something that's, it's not even conservative. It's about the desire for authenticity. You want that, you crave that. Whether you are from here, whether you're not from here. You kind of wish everyone could live according to their full authentic selves. And you kind of hate it when it is framed in a way for the tourist gaze. And then you sort of think, people got to eat. And it's a hard realization. So, again, an important reading. I don't know if it's a good reading, but I think it's a very vital reading, which was Resorts, Culture and Music, the Cape Breton Tourism Cluster by Keith Brown and Ruth Ann Geddes. Be well, my friends.